2, and this is debate on clauses 8 to 18. And the question is that part 2 stand part.
Mr. Chairman.
I call Dr. Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to speak in this first contribution on clauses 8 and 10. 8 and 10, of course, being where the transitional governing body is established and the process for electing members to that body. Because, Mr. Chairman, this really is where the substance of this legislation is. And these parts of the bill, these clauses of the bill, were subject to a number of submissions. And the bulk of the submissions that the Select Committee did here, that 76 submissions from individuals and organisations, and 1,076 of the submissions through the form-based submissions objected to the non-democratic mode that was being established under this transitional body. For example, the Royal Forest and Bird Society of New Zealand, in its submissions, is opposed to the government-elected members of council who the people of Christchurch are expected to trust have their interests at heart without any ability to know if that is the case. And this was just one of many submissions, because what clause 8 of this legislation does is establish that there be 7 elected members and 6 appointed members. This is the part of the legislation where the minister is able to appoint these members to the body, rather than in every other part of the country where electors who are registered to vote get to elect 100% of their regional councillors. And I'd just like to pick up on one of the minister's contributions that he made in a previous part of the legislation. He seemed to in no way answer the call for why it was the case for a differentiated set of circumstances was required in Canterbury, and I'd like to ask the minister whether or not he has plans for rolling this out any further outside of Canterbury, because I don't think just the people of Canterbury should be concerned about this legislation. This legislation sets a dangerous precedent that the government, the central government, takes control of what should be a locally elected council and puts that in place. And this isn't something that the minister will be unaware of, because this is, of course, something that the minister did receive some advice on, and that we know that some of the updates that the Minister for the Environment was receiving was the purpose of local government includes providing democratic local decision-making and action. Long-term unconventional arrangements in Canterbury could create a precedent for further ad hoc local governance and service delivery arrangements. So officials were warning ministers that there would be a concern that this is a precedent-setting set of circumstances that we are putting in place under Clause 8 of this legislation in the transitional governing body. And Mr. Chairman, I am most eager to hear the Minister and the Chair talk more about that. My colleague, the member for Mana, who raised some of the Law Society's submissions around this very fundamental aspect of who it is that is going to govern the region of Canterbury, its services and its assets. And they stated that the proposed further suspension of full democracy is inconsistent with core constitutional values. The justification for the proposed mixed model governance structure is not sufficiently convincing, and the need for the continuance of appointed commissioners has not been demonstrated. And I would like to hear the Minister's response to the Law Society raising that in its submission to the Select Committee. Because, Mr. Speaker, I think that we shouldn't ignore submissions that came before the Select Committee. The Select Committee was a terrible process. There was only around a week that was open for people to get their submissions in, and it was truncated. And, Mr. Chairman, it is not acceptable when a piece of legislation contains a clause such as Clause 8, which is the further suspension of democracy in a region, that a minister thinks it's okay and a government thinks that it's okay to put that legislation through in a rushed and clumsy process. As I said in an earlier contribution, it's not like the minister didn't know. It had been 3 years since he'd last cancelled elections in Canterbury. You would have thought he would have had it marked on his calendar. Time to cancel elections again in Canterbury, and could have planned his time accordingly. But no, instead the people of Canterbury didn't even get an adequate opportunity to comment on, Mr Chairman,
Dr Megan Woods.
to comment on such a fundamental clause as Clause 8 of this legislation. I'd also like to talk about the Clause 10 now, Mr Speaker, which is the process for electing electors. And this, of course, will, once this legislation is enacted, that what will happen is there will be a representation, the representation processes will go into place and the boundaries will be established. But in terms of the number of electors, already some work has been done on this, and Clause 10 sets this out very clearly in the bill. The 7 elected council members of the transitional governing body must be elected at the 2016 election. Goes by that they must be through a first-past-the-post system. And then the 1 member must be elected by electors within the districts of the following local authorities and the South Canterbury constituency, and it goes through and it names the Mid Canterbury constituency, the North Canterbury constituency. But Mr Chairman, if we look very closely at what ministers were receiving advice of the possible numbers in each of these constituency, we see very clearly the government's agenda laid bare. If you live in Christchurch City under the government's proposed model, that you will have 1 regional councillor for every 90,400, no, not you, Mr Chairman, you don't live there. You're lucky enough to have an elected regional council. But for the people of Canterbury who live in Canterbury and they live in Christchurch City, they will have 1 elected regional council for every 90,475 people. That is only 4 regional councillors for the whole of Christchurch City. But, Mr Chairman, if someone were lucky enough to live in South Canterbury, their representation is somewhat more salubrious, that they are going to have greater representation, because there will be a regional councillor for every 59,770,000 electors. Now, Mr Chairman, I want to hear the minister take a call and explain the discrepancies in what is otherwise just a good old-fashioned gerrymander. That this is nothing more than the government wanting to stop urban councillors coming in with what they say might be an environmental agenda and asking some questions around the big issues that need to be faced in Canterbury. And Mr Chairman, it shows how short-sighted this government is, how out of touch and how arrogant. It talks that one of the justifications for putting in place this gerrymandered council is the need that we have around our water. But it also does talk about the functions that have to happen in the recovery and now the regeneration of Canterbury. Well, a big part of that has to happen in Christchurch City, Mr Chairman, and a large part of that function it needs to happen within the city. And to say that there should only be 1 councillor for every 90,000 electors is simply unacceptable. The role that the ECAN has to fulfil in Christchurch City, its functions that are now enacted under the Regenerate Christchurch legislation, it can be a proponent of regeneration plans. It has a very core aspect to play. So what we're saying, it's not people from Christchurch City that will be proposing those regeneration plans, because we're going to have underrepresentation of that core area of the region in this newly constituted body. But no, we'll have people from all outside Christchurch. So I am very much looking forward to the minister's call on how it is that that can be justified. I am also looking forward to the minister taking a call and answering the Law Commission's criticism of what is being established under Clause 8 of this legislation, because these are fundamental and important questions, Mr Chairman, that none of us should take lightly. That let's be very clear, we are standing in this House debating legislation that will well, it won't further because the vote's already been taken away, but do nothing to put in place the democratic rights that the people of Christchurch and Canterbury should consider they have a right to like any other New Zealander. This is a democratically elected body of people that are debating whether or not a minister has the power to just override electors and appoint who they want, because this is a minister who is on the record as saying that democracy is risky. And when we have a minister that thinks democracy is risky, we have in legislation things such as Clause 8 that take away the right of Cantabrians to elect their regional council. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable.